Um, so great to be here in Sao Paulo, and thank you for this invitation. Um, you might be asking yourself why an architect is here on the stage to talk about dying. Well, for me, to be an architect is to think about death, to know that what we build today will likely outlive us, and it will house a community far in the future, one we probably cannot know. I know that isn't always the public opinion of architects. Often, architecture is talked about as a non-essential cost, that architects are driven by their egos, and that the construction of monuments to themselves. They want to build their dreams, not our dreams. But what is the cost of not having architecture that's built for us? What is the cost to our lives today if we fail to consider the impacts of the future built world, the one we can't fully inhabit? During my first final exams in design school, I was thrown face first into this question. I was up for multiple nights, the kind of frenetic work where I didn't answer the phone. When I finally did look at my phone, I saw that I had missed almost 30 unanswered calls, all from my mother, all with increasing frequency. I walked out of the review room and I sat down in the lobby of the school, something that looked kind of like our lobby here, and I knew that something horrible had happened. You see, a year before, my father had been diagnosed with cancer and he had been fighting it, but it had returned and he had gone into what I learned was septic shock. My mother was in an ambulance calling frantically en route to New York City to save his life. "You might not see him again," she said in the first voicemail. "Get here as soon as you can," she said in the second. But what was in voicemail number 20, I thought? What was in number 30? Had he died while I was being delirious with my final presentation, that could mean very little. Just then, a family friend showed up in that very lobby, and she'd been calling me too, and she was looking for me, looking to drive me to New York City. He was barely alive, she told me, and we left without packing. When we got to this building, we had heard of how famous the cancer care was, and we hoped he might survive. But as we approached, I couldn't help but feel a sense of doom. Was this impenetrable fortress the final resting place of his life? We lived off and on this hallway for the next 3 weeks, through the holidays, through Christmas, and I saw his hope waver. For exercise, he was told to walk around this interior floor plate in loops. There were no windows to look out of. The walls seemed designed to protect against medical equipment banging into them, the floors to make insufferable sounds even louder. This building may have prolonged his life, but it didn't seem to think about nourishing it. It was, I thought, devoid of design. All of the things we were being taught about, the beauty of architecture, where was the beauty when my father faced his own demise? It was, I thought, the cost of not having design. It was the price of indignity. When my father finally did leave, now with a clear expiration date communicated to all of us by clinicians, I had one thought in my head, which was, if I was ever to be an architect, I had to design a hospital. I found a chance to do that sooner than I might have dreamed, actually. At school, I had, that very same time, gone to a lecture by this amazing man, Dr. Paul Farmer, who's a leading health advocate for the global poor. And Paul introduced me to the idea that buildings are making people sicker, he said. And for the poorest in the world, this is causing epidemic-level problems. In this hospital, featured here in South Africa, patients who walked in with, say, a broken leg walked out with what's called extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis. And simple designs for infection control had not been considered, he told me, and people had died because of it. Where are the architects, Dr. Farmer said? If buildings are making people sicker, where are the designers and architects who can make buildings that heal? That following summer, a few classmates and I moved to this rural village in the mountainous hillsides of Rwanda. For the next year, we were to live in the town of Butaro and stayed in this dormitory, which had been used as a jail during the horrific genocide in 1994. And we were there to design and build a new medical facility with Dr. Farmer and his team. We were young, we were outsiders, but we applied ourselves to the questions that had been neglected or taken for granted, and we sought to search for new answers. Like, if hallways are making patients sick, why not turn the hospital inside out and make people walk in the exterior? If mechanical systems rarely ever work, what if we could design a facility that could breathe just through natural ventilation? And what about the patient's experience? Evidence shows that a simple view of a window can radically improve health outcomes, so what if we could make a hospital where every patient had a room and a window with a view? Simple, site-specific designs can make buildings that heal, we learned. I learned something else on this hill, though. This is me at one point. Designing buildings is one thing, but getting them built is actually quite another thing. When we were building the Batara Hospital, I trained under this brilliant engineer. His name is Bruce Nizet, and he taught me about construction in a different way than I'd been taught in school. When we had to excavate this hill, for example, and a bulldozer was expensive and hard to get to site, Bruce suggested doing it by hand. He recalled a process in Rwanda called ubudehe, which means community works for the community. Hundreds of people came with shovels and hoes, and we excavated that hill in half the time and in half the cost of that bulldozer. Instead of importing furniture, Bruce started a guild, bringing in master carpenters and trained others in how to make furniture by hand. And on this project site, only 15 years after the horrific Rwandan genocide, Bruce insisted that we hire people from all ethnic backgrounds and that half of them be women. If Dr. Farmer had taught me that buildings can heal, Bruce taught me that building processes can heal, not just those who were sick, but also how it affects the entire community as a whole. Using this local way of building, even formal and aesthetic decisions can be thought about as ways to improve lives. In Batara, we chose to use this local volcanic rock, often considered a nuisance by farmers and piled on the side of the road for free. We worked with these masons to hand cut these stones and form them into the walls of the hospital. And when they began at this corner, as you can see here, by the time they wrapped around the entire building, these masons were so good at intricately putting these stones together, they asked if they could take down the original wall and to rebuild it. And you can see what is possible. It is a thing of beauty, I think. But to me, the beauty comes from the fact that I know that hands cut these stones, and they formed them into this thick wall, made only in this place with rocks from this very soil. What if in every building we encountered, we asked not just what its environmental footprint was, but what was the human handprint of those that made it? Soon after the hospital was finished, doctors came to live here, and we had to build housing for those that were using it, using the same techniques and material palette, including lighting and furniture, all made by these masons and carpenters from this very community. Another housing project for nurses emerged in 2014, and its shape reflected the mountainous hillsides of this part of the country and the valley that they climbed down. In 2013, the first cancer center in the entire country was invested in, something that meant a lot for me and the people around us. And they placed it on this very site in this rural country hospital, far from the capital. It included large open areas for treatment and movable walls, which helped the patients survive the boredom of the day. And last week, their families will have housing for them as we opened this brand new facility last week, as they come to take care of their own family members like we did that very day in New York City and stay in that medical facility. Now we have housing for those families to come and take care of their loved ones. The same work has then led to new national policy with the government of Rwanda, a new district hospital that's under construction here in the Nyarugenge district. It will be twice the size of Batara Hospital and push these same principles further a bit more in a southern district of the country. And finally, this past January, we completed on the next hill over from the hospital a new medical university that will train doctors to take these rights-driven lessons of healthcare and deploy them in regions throughout the world. The University of Global Health Equity caps a 10-year construction project, which began with a simple question from one doctor after a lecture, which was, can we make buildings that heal? Can we invest in the best that we have for the most vulnerable communities among us? I've come to think of this like the slow food movement, but something closer for architecture. Something where we make visible those invisible choices that we make, and we assign value to them in order to decide upon the kind of society we want to live in. We took this local fabrication philosophy and we started to practice it around the world and started a firm, which is called MASS Design Group, which stands for a model of architecture which serves society. So I want to thank Roy for this commitment and notion of service, which we fully believe in. It asks really, what more can architecture do, and how can we use it as an agent for change? We thought about it like in the dense urban condition of post-earthquake Haiti. After the earthquake in 2011, many aid organizations came to stop the bleeding of this horrific tragedy and erected prefabricated temporary shelters in these pop-up cities. These emergency shelters were necessary to house hundreds of thousands of displaced people. But before too long, these tents revealed deeper structural issues. Haitians needed shelter, but they also needed jobs and thriving local markets. The lessons from Rwanda made me realize that emergency shelters only addressed one of these issues, shelter, when it could have also provided both jobs and leveraged local material sourcing. Conceptually, this local approach to building in Haiti made sense, but how did it work in practice? Outside Port-au-Prince, there is a vast deforested countryside, denuded of wood and eroded of topsoil. Haiti has very few local materials left to use for construction, so understandably, nearly every material is imported. But Haitians have innovated locally in many other ways. For example, Haitians are famous for their ornate metal work, often upcycled from industrial oil drums and refuse metal. Its many applications are quite stunning, such as the local taxis called tap-taps, which have these vibrant exoskeletons. Mackenzieville, featured here, runs one of the larger metal cooperatives in Port-au-Prince. You can see his amazing work. And we worked with him to take that ornamental work to a scale of a full building. So we carefully constructed a strategy with him and his team that was informed both by his handmade work and our design ambitions for response and performance, composing a facade of metal panels with almost 36,000 individual cut apertures, all made by hand and all intended to improve the experience of the patients inside. The clinic, designed to fight cholera, a waterborne disease, and other waterborne diseases, opened in 2015. The facade reminds me of those tap-taps designed for light and air, privacy, and beauty, and made by the hands that will protect it and preserve it. But most importantly, it was a place we thought of as the last stop for many of those afflicted with the disease. What would it be like to die of this horrible disease in a place hot and disgusting, difficult to stomach, and full of death instead of full of life? It is true that the global conditions do not always allow for a fully local construction force, but we should make ethical and transparent decisions that specify materials carefully whenever possible. What Haiti revealed was that if we don't act quickly to invest in the social and economic infrastructure crucial to surviving the next disaster, we fail to leverage one of the most empowering tools of our discipline, investing in the livelihoods of the communities that we serve. This cholera treatment center is now saving lives as a medical center, but its lasting impact may be the hundreds of jobs it produced and the hundreds of thousands of dollars put into the local economy. As Mackenzie said to us, when you hire an artisan, you invest in the entire community. That same doctor asked us to design another medical facility, this one to help reduce patient-to-doctor infection rates of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, that same disease we confronted in Rwanda. In this center, where patients all have the disease, our research showed a different risk pathway, this time not to other patients, but to nurses and doctors and janitorial staff. And so we designed a simple layout of rooms and hallways that allowed for outdoor, open-air consultation between doctors and their patients, a better scenario for protection. And we added simple extra door to the bathroom from the hallway, which protected cleaning staff from the most infectious patients and their rooms. In this facility, we're seeing much better adherence to the intensive drug regimen required to treat tuberculosis. Infection rates are down, and personal protective equipment uses are up. But maybe the most striking outcome is this one. When the clinic was still in these fabric tents after the earthquake, behind barbed wire, patients who took these drugs would often have terrible psychotic reactions, like extreme anxiety and hallucinations. And attempted suicide was often very common. In this new facility, doctors recently told us how much the design has calmed the patients and how attempted suicide rates have dropped to 0. The medical mantra, do no harm, should apply to the built environment around us as well. But that should be the bare minimum of what we do. Our bodies and our minds are so influenced by the spaces that we design. If we strive to design for the dignity of all individuals, we may find outcomes we never dreamed of that we could influence or count. And this was the case in Port-au-Prince. In Malawi, we saw a different issue. Malawi has one of the highest rates of maternal and infant death in the world. This in part because clinics are far away from villages, and the journey is arduous for anyone, let alone a woman in her 3rd trimester. Imagine having to walk for hours right before you give birth. And then when you arrive, you encountered a facility that was like this, filthy and scary, not to mention vastly insufficient for the amount of women they needed to serve. So the Ministry of Health asked us if we designed a new center that women actually wanted to go to, could we attract more mothers to the hospital where they would have safer, professionally attended births? Although the brief specified a single building with only 36 beds, we knew this would be insufficient as each woman came with 3 to 5 family members or attendants. And so we actually needed to design a space for a few hundred people with the budget for a few dozen people. So we separated the building into a village of smaller buildings that could change over time. Using simple, low-cost construction of earthen blocks and simple wall variations, we saved money and introduced variety for the multiplicity of uses needed for waiting for birth. And then we extended the roofs to allow for benches that could turn into beds at night, and outdoor areas that would become spaces of communal gathering, and the amazing gift of life. We all knew that architecture alone would not bring these women safer births, but without it, the tools we have to ensure the mothers' lives are protected are actually greatly diminished. We often hear from clients when they first call us that they don't need a fancy building, that all they need is the bare minimum to get the work done more effectively and efficiently. But we have borne witness to the bare minimum, and it is bleak, and sometimes it's actually dangerous. Settling for the bare minimum is not fighting for the preferential option for the poor. It sacrifices our ability to fulfill our profession's sacred responsibility, the creation of dignity. There is another way that architecture can heal, I believe, and that is creating space for our traumas to find a resting place. Rwanda as a country is committed extensively to building sites of memory and memorials throughout the country. And after 20 years, what they term genocide ideology has weakened, and communities are much more resilient against ethnic violence. But these successful lessons of Rwanda are not known the world over. And of course, today, we know intolerance and ideological division are again on the rise in the world, dividing our communities and making us adversaries. In Europe, in the United Kingdom, in Brazil, and of course in the US, anti-Semitism and racism and ideological intolerance are reemerging around us. What choices will we make? Will we allow our creative work to be used as a weapon to reinforce intolerance? Or will we use our work as a tool to strengthen and empower the communities that we serve? In London, a new project speaks directly to the need for architecture to fight intolerance, the Commission for a New National Memorial to the Jewish Victims of the Holocaust. With the architect John McCaslin and the landscape architect Lily Jenks, we designed a memorial that seeks to design for a more tolerant future. And our idea begins with a stone. In Jewish tradition, when someone dies, family members come and place pebbles, stones, on top of gravesites to honor their loved ones and to bind generations together. The word for stone in Hebrew has rich meaning. The word is pronounced even. When split, it separates the words av and ben, meaning father and son. The stone's very name carries within it one of the most beautiful thoughts, which is continuity, handing down from one generation to the next. The centerpiece of our project then is a pile of 6 million individual stones at the center of London, one each for the 6 million Jewish victims murdered during the Holocaust. But instead of merely reflecting upon this enormous pile of stones, we would invite visitors to take a stone and take it home with them and choose to participate in the fight against intolerance in all its forms. Each stone will begin a new journey, a new diaspora, into the homes and schools and into the living rooms of families to remind them and educate them and act as a physical reminder, a talisman of the pledge that they've made for that fight against injustice. Eventually, after 10 years or so, this pile diminishes and shows proof or evidence that 6 million hands have chosen to join this fight. It gives us a sense of hope. And when it disappears, what remains is really a space of healing in the center of London, a space of vulnerability, inscribed with the traces of these very stones and the remnants of those very lives that we've chosen to protect. 3 years ago, I met this amazing man, Brian Stevenson, who is an intrepid and brilliant civil rights leader, a lawyer who fights for those incarcerated, condemned, and imprisoned in America. He claims that it is capital that creates poverty. It is injustice, and we need to repair these structural systems in order to break out of these historical and traumatic injustices. So he had an idea to mark every site of lynching in America, lynching of African Americans, and document the undocumented and the unmarked locations where these individuals were killed and hung and murdered, over 4,500 of them, in public killings throughout the United States between 1880 and 1950. These crimes were never prosecuted and were so horrible, their only intent was to terrify residents into a caste system of subservience and servitude. Countries like Germany and South Africa and, of course, Rwanda have built memorials, as I mentioned, to the atrocities in order to heal their nation from injustice, to overcome and attempt to repair these injuries. America has never done anything like this, and instead has shied away from apologizing and wrestling with their own complicity in these power structures that remained. Brian wanted to dismantle these structures and needed a physical memorial to do so. So I flew down to Montgomery, Alabama, and there I walked around with him, and he pointed out the many markers commemorating the white supremacy of the Confederate South, who lost the Civil War in 1860. Very few places commemorate the losers of wars, but America loves to do that. And then he walked me to this hill, and he pointed to the entire city that he could overlook, where the riverboats brought slaves from the upper South to the lower South, and the Capitol building where the Governor George Wallace stood and said segregation forever from its staircase. And then he pointed to the ground below us where he wanted to build a memorial and commemorate these killings and begin a new chapter of truth-telling in America. On April 25th, 2018, we opened the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, otherwise known as the National Lynching Memorial. And it's meant to be a familiar and subtle form, something evoking a colonnade or a pavilion. And as you enter, you see these columns bear the names of counties and the names of those victims from each county where people were lynched. But as you go further, you see the ground drop, and these columns rise above you, reflecting the public hangings that often happened in the public square. On further descent, the stories of these lynchings often often banal events like whistling or looking the wrong way, which could get you killed. Then the light and shadows, they wash over the floor, orienting us and disorienting us simultaneously. Deeper still within the bowels is a space of reflection, a wall of water, cleansing down an audible recollection of the horror of our nation's past and its effort to overcome it, the hope to begin again, to move on with restoration. And then as you climb to the center, you see a hill, and you climb that hill, and you see a view of the city beyond, and those very structures of power that have reinforced these injustices in front of you. It is this new spatial perspective which re-centers the power relationships of the city and begins to attempt to rewrite and heal the trauma and pain and blood embedded in the very soil and the structures of the American landscape. But outside a second chapter of the memorial appears. There are identical markers to those that hung above us, but they are outside now in a temporary condition to be moved to the counties where these very lynchings occurred. Slowly, over time, as each of these is removed, like the stones in the Holocaust Memorial, we will visualize a nation beginning a process of transformation, healing in all of the 800 counties, truth-telling, bearing witness, giving voice to the names of those which have been erased, and intentionally naming them in an order to represent and reflect upon their gift of their life to the freedom that we seek. It summons strength to think about this kind of effort, and it requires a grassroots movement from each of these individual counties. One where over 400 of these have already been claimed in the first year and are waiting for displacement around the country. Seen here is one of the sculptures in the landscape by the amazing Hank Willis Thomas. It's a sculpture about police violence called Hands Up. And it's an image which seems to reflect well the historical and contemporary relationship of these two monuments to injustice. I love this image because it seems to lift up the memorial roof itself, giving it new weight as a structure held together by our ancestors, those who came before us, as a collective, ongoing, never-ending resistance to injustice. And the markers themselves, they bleed. They are living. They wrestle with the remnant of rain and moisture dripping down and staining the ground beneath it, reminding us that the structures around us represent the living condition, the process that we're in, the fight to heal from injustices of the past and make do with the terror and trauma that we deal with on a daily basis. We asked how our lessons from Rwanda might inform our project here and how we could include as many people as possible in the process of building, like Ubudehe. We thought about a simple act of collecting soil from every site of lynching and giving each victim an urn of their own earth. This idea caught on, and the Equal Justice Initiative and their team began sending out families to collect soil and pay tribute to these murdered victims. The soil collection project caught on now, and every jar of soil from the state of Alabama has been collected and brought to the Equal Justice Initiative's headquarters. Sharing the horror of these bodies hung and killed and murdered with impunity, and giving space to their lives and naming their locations so we too can associate our own complicity in these power structures in order to dismantle them. One of EJI's clients and partners, this amazing man, Anthony Ray Hinton, who spent almost 30 years on death row for a crime he did not commit, said in collecting the soil of Will McBride that if Will left one drop of blood, one drop of sweat, one hair follicle, I pray that I dug it up and his whole body would now be at rest. The collection and participation is itself an act of healing, an act of overcoming the loss of death that lands for generations, sometimes a century, is still necessary to engage in these pilgrimages, in these acts of justice. They've helped me think about healing from loss and healing from death, and the very human need we have to connect with those we have lost access to and tell their story and spatialize their lives in order to overcome them and to give us fuel to survive. Which brings me to this last project. At the opening of the memorial in April 2018, two women came up to me, the two women featured here, after the event, and they told me about their experience walking through the memorial. They shared the stories of their sons who were killed by gun violence in the streets of Chicago, and they shared the need for something to commemorate them and all the others dying of what you may know about is America's national epidemic of gun violence. On the left is Pamela Bosley, and on the right is Annette Nons Holt. And they're pictured here with their lost sons, Terrell and Blair. And they are founders of an organization of mothers in Chicago called Purpose Over Pain, a parent advocacy group working for gun control legislation and to address this national epidemic. I came back from the experience meeting, they're very transformed by this idea. Could it move the needle? Could we begin to change the narrative on gun violence if we had a space, a collection where we could come together and see our shared humanity, create a space for that necessary reflection, and alter the debate that we have in our country from polarity to proximity? Hank Willis Thomas, that same artist I mentioned, and a good friend, we spoke together and we agreed to think about it, and we began to work on this new memorial for victims of gun violence. Just to give you a sense of the crisis in America, it's a staggering crisis. There are almost 100 gun-related deaths in America per day. In 2019, the rate of gun deaths increased to this number, and it's been increasing every year. Since 2000, there's been a 19% increase in overall firearms deaths in the US, totaling over 35,000 lives lost in 2017. As of 2017, more Americans died by gun violence than motor vehicle deaths, and this was not the case the year before. What we don't hear, though, is that although mass shootings and street violence is a very real condition of everyday life, 2/3, 75% of gun deaths are actually suicides, which is a narrative we don't hear about in our daily news cycle. And those suicides add up to 700 people per week, or 3,000 people per month, or the fact that 44%, an unreal number, of American adults know someone that has been shot or killed by guns. It is an issue that affects every single person in the United States, and it makes it a nation of gun violence survivors. But these numbers, while powerful for shocking the public, shocking you, or policymakers, are still abstract numbers, and they flatten these individuals into spreadsheets and points of data and endless polarized dialogue on cable television. As Pamela said, we only hear the numbers, but you never tie those to the names. I want you to see who my son was, and I want you to say his name. These numbers, another way to say it, have taken away their dignity. And among all the deaths is the injustice of this epidemic treating so many human beings as expendable lives to fight over in the political arena. So the question emerged for us, how do we tell the story of the vastness of this epidemic without losing the beauty of the individual life? And I was reminded of this amazing project, which happened in the late 80s, during the height of the AIDS epidemic, where politicians were fighting over treatment and research and moralizing the communities impacted. Activists took a different turn and developed the idea of a national AIDS quilt. They asked loved ones of victims to create a single square everyone unique to those who died of the epidemic, and to bring it to Washington. The squares assembled tell the story of love and loss and life, and they give each of these individuals space. Their dignity is preserved and unique, but combined together they tell a national story of negligence and political failure. At a certain scale, this message is impossible to ignore. Do something. These are our brothers and our sisters and our children. This is the AIDS quilt covering the entire National Mall. This project is both temporary and profoundly permanent. It's spatial, most importantly. It deals with the sense of the infinite, that uncountable amount of people influenced and affected by this epidemic. And it takes the death of the individual and all the misunderstandings and contradictions together in one square to fight for policy change and to make change for the future. It holds the tension to be both a number and a human being quite successfully, to be an agent for change after we are gone. As it traveled around the country, taking different forms in different cities, it changed shape and adapted to spaces, but the DNA was the same. The story of us, the story of you, the story of our loved ones, the story of change. Policy change did occur after this event, a national movement which affected and tore at the reality of the suffering as the thing that we can all get behind to cut through the polarity of political infighting. It occurs to us that this is maybe what we need for an epidemic which is current, something that no amount of mass shootings will stop the sides from hardening their solidarity with each other. Instead, we need to think about the individual, the life lost, the name, and hold some form of contradiction between the individual and the total. So, for Pam and Annette, we thought about a grassroots movement, a campaign, where we would create a national conversation about gun violence, asking any victim, if they so choose, to reach out to us and to contribute an artifact. We'll send each person a glass box or have them come to us and give them a glass box. And in that box, they'll put this artifact of their loved one, a token, a memory, a talisman. We'd gather those artifacts, and then we would cast them into a glass brick for permanence. And we'd assemble all of those bricks and construct glass houses, these haunting structures of our hopes and our nightmares, structures that are vulnerable and fragile, but standing as beacons of memory and transformation, giving space to those numbers. Last week, we began our first collection of these objects in Chicago. And to say it was a profound experience is a vast understatement. I'm beyond real words to describe the experience of sitting across from these mothers as they brought in objects, t-shirts, hats, symbols of their loved ones who have been taken from them, and their names have been erased. And the ability to stand there with them, to hear their story, to listen to the narrative of who they were, introduced such love and commitment and vulnerability from this community here in Chicago, but this is the same all over the country. And the willingness to participate in something that could be national and to give something to it, an object that they've been holding on to. These chapels that so many people have constructed in their bedrooms that are still remaining with the objects of their loved ones. No one asking their names, no one asking who they were, no one talking about anything except the political condition of this polarity. Instead, now we have something to do, something to contribute, something to participate in, something to make together. Here is Pamela with a small installation to her son Terrell, who was killed coming out of church, where he was in the church band with his guitar, stepping into a van to go home and hit by random street violence, a drive-by shooting, and a random bullet. This installation tells of his love of music, his religion, his faith, and who he was, not a number, but her son. In 2 weeks, we will finish construction of the first of these 4 houses in Chicago at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And it will stand until December. And we'll be collecting objects throughout the entire fall, from September to December, or actually to January. January 5th, which is the day of Terrell's birthday. And our goal is to continue collecting these thousands of objects, fill these bricks, and then to take this project, like the AIDS quilt, all over the country. Build houses in every state, build a movement where you can't ignore these fragile structures that we must pilgrimage to represent and see the violence in physical form and the loss in spatial form. In the end, the best we can hope is that the lives we lost are given some space that they deserve, and their numbers collected help us as a nation heal from one of our great injustices and one of our intractable epidemics. In this work, I'm not naive to imagine that memorials alone will end gun violence or lynching or genocide, but I have been convinced that without spatializing these figures, without giving them name and physical dimension, we cannot fully lay these burdens down, and we carry this loss from generation to generation through families. If we do not have the spaces to ritualize and to evoke the traumas we've experienced, we may fail to fully embed deep in our memory the tools to fight for the world we seek collectively to inhabit. This is why I believe architecture has a role to play in our collective fight for healing. My father, pictured here with my mother, did eventually succumb to cancer. What was a 3-month death sentence had become a gift of 2.5 years together, where we were able to sit and talk about nothing at all, and just be together, a gift that while he died very young, I still think about those lost from gun violence. I feel very lucky that I had time to say goodbye in its many forms. This is a month before his death. He was hosting an event with all his closest friends in our home, and he spoke about his lifetime's work as a civil servant and the unfinished projects he was proud to advance and to fight for. I felt standing there that he was passing the baton, handing me the stone, giving us the freedom to fight beyond the grave and give us fuel to live without regret or pain or anger at loss, but to live as he did, with great hope. This is why, for me, buildings matter to us. It is not simply the sculptures of artistry. No, it's the many batons left for us from one generation to the next. Architecture is that built manifestation of hope. In this way, it is architecture that can be an agent in our ability to survive, in our ability to heal. This is why buildings matter to us. We believe that architecture is a mechanism of healing. It is a mechanism of hope. Thank you very much.